This is our virtual live Boulder Week startup session on public relations and why public relations is the essential frontline worker for your brand. Very timely right now. My name is Ben Travis. I'm this year's marketing track captain as well as marketing manager at Bonusly here in Boulder. And this year's Boulder Startup Week is, as you might have seen, a little bit different than past years. So we're adapting through a 100% digital event with the theme of service to community. And this session will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube for reference in the future. Before we start, I'd like to give a quick shout out to our sponsor. So many thanks to Techstars, Honey, Name.com, Downtown Boulder Partnership, and CU for their sponsorship of Boulder Startup Week. Without them, this would not be possible. For some quick housekeeping tips, we'll be using the chat and the Q&A features for this session. So if you can, real quick, look at your Zoom webinar chat window. And right now it should be set to all panelists, but if you'd like to share with the panelists and all attendees, you can change that and also send messages to individuals. And would highly encourage you to share any questions or thoughts as the session is going on. That way we can address those in a timely fashion. And now I'll kick things over to Justin from Cast Influence to introduce the panel. Take it away, Justin.
Oh, I thought you were introducing the panel, Ben. Okay.
I thought you were introducing. My bad.
Well, I can jump in. I don't have all their profiles in front of me, but we have Leah Taylor from Cast Influence. She's a co-founder of Cast Influence, and I don't know if you want to raise your hand, Leah. She's been marketing and PR for a better part of 20 years, and has just done some pretty amazing things with some amazing different clients across the board. We have Drea. I'm totally going to botch this even though I asked you earlier. Knufkin. I got it? Okay. And she's from Treble PR. Again, I don't have her bio in front of me, VP of Content. And then we have Michelle Zach, Techstars, Director of PR. And then we have myself. So I'm co-founder of Cast Influence Marketing and PR.
And just a quick shout out to Marissa as well.
Oh, Marissa. Marissa Arnold. There you go. Marissa Arnold, Grayscale Investments, Director of Communications. Sorry about that, Ben.
That's my bad. Thanks for taking it. Appreciate it.
But yeah, let's get started. So I'll jump right in. I'm going to start with actually Leah on this question because I think it kind of leads the way to some of the other questions. And we're going to have to do this in a little different format than probably you've seen in panels in the past. We're going to ask questions kind of to each one directly and then get input for everybody across the panel. So the landscape in PR, the trending landscape and things that have been happening in PR have changed pretty drastically, as we all know, because of the response to COVID-19. What are you hearing from reporters right now, Leah?
Yeah, it's a good question. Basically, there's 20 stories in the day to tell, and there's time to tell one story. The reporters that I've been working with pretty consistently that used to have a beat for technology or retail or e-commerce or software as a service, they've now been pulled off of those beats and are 100% focused on COVID. So everybody is pitching in and helping everyone out. They're kind of working 24 hours a day, weekends, evenings, like, you know, the media landscape, they're very, very stretched thin. And that's just because that has become the channel of communication for anyone to get information now on what's going on and how do I stay safe? How does this virus get passed? How do I open as a business? How do I keep my employees safe? Media has become such a focus now for the source of truth. So yeah, I could say that it's only made the reporter's job and analyst's job that much harder.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think there's a lot has to be said about the messaging and how messaging has changed just in the last couple months, which brings me to my next question. And I want you to actually piggyback on this question too, but to Drea, how have you adapted your writing messaging to more a recessionary type audience, and what should the messaging strategy really include right now for businesses? And this doesn't have to do with just recession or economy. It could be, you know, any of the verticals or things that are happening right now with COVID-19. And maybe if you have some examples you can share.
Sure. So like Leah said, everyone wants to know what's going on. It's like maybe 3 months ago, the focus was still big. It was enthusiastic. It was positive. It's like, what can we do next? Where are the opportunities? You know, how can I project my wisdom as a thought leader forward into 2030? And with the pandemic, everything just went shrunk down. How do I survive? So when I look to the messaging and content strategies, we think about, well, what is not credible anymore? You know, something like ag tech for the next decade, for example, has become really hard to predict, because who could have predicted what happened at the Tyson meat plants? You know, who could have predicted the shortages, the supply chain problems? So to take an example to continue with this example, one of our clients is in ag tech innovation, and we changed any sort of forward-looking content to a sort of more measured, scenario type content. Here are 3 scenarios for ag tech in 2020. Then I talked to the CEO and was like, well, what other areas of expertise can we harness now that the mood is more cautious and that the focus is more on survival? And in our discussions, it turned out he's also an expert in, biosecurity and agroterrorism, which would have sounded alarmist 4 months ago during, our very positive times. But now it's like, yeah, let's look at how we can protect ourselves. Let's talk to that instead. So we've changed focus in the wording to reflect that more protective attitude. And, that's still a work in progress, but early pitches on that got a whole lot of tier 1 interest, including the New York Times. So that was pretty good.
Yeah, and I think this question is really relevant across the board, and we have it in kind of various ways when we talked before we got on this panel. But what are some of these practices that we should be implementing? I'm going to go to you, Michelle, with Techstars, and what is the media relations strategy kind of been during this pandemic, and what kind of examples are you seeing as well?
Yeah, I've been seeing the same things that Leah and Drea spoke to. In terms of reporters, Leah talked through how busy they are and that they've been pulled off their other beats. So you're dealing with a range of awareness and their stress levels are really high. What we have been, in terms of a positioning standpoint, because of the makeup of Techstars in our organization and our role in the startup community, we've really tried to be a resource to all of our audiences, to founders, to partners, to the network. And that goes the same for media. The more helpful I can be right off the bat, the more I get traction with reporters. I had an inbound from the New York Times just this past week, and in my response back to that person, I included a starter of, here's a couple of things that might get you started. Here's a little bit of material that may shorten your research. And then let me work on setting you up with my founders and things like that. And I find that because the reporters are so busy, and some of them are covering unfamiliar territory, or they're just quantity of what their editors want from them, the writing is not as good as you'd normally expect. Even seasoned, great writing reporters, it's just a matter of moving too fast. And you've got some very, very green reporters out there. So that strategy works on a number of fronts. It helps ensure better quality coverage, better messaging, better numbers, a better positioning for the brand and the company. It's helpful to them, which makes them much more receptive. And I think, one of the things that I often think about is what they're going through. They're going through the same things that we all are. And so the human aspect of it, they're really stressed. And so instead of, getting into that kind of traditional PR journalist, sometimes it's attention and it's a push-pull role. It's more like a we're all in this together kind of role. And it's much more of a, like, I'm there for you. And it's worked really well. And it's genuine, it's like helping people out. And that's been really helpful for us across the board.
You hit on something there. Actually, some of my little brief observations on what's happening between the interaction between PR and reporters is it's been more friendly than I think I've ever seen it. Not that it hasn't been friendly, but I think everyone's just really understanding of each other right now, which is great. I'm going to add or go into Marissa. Marissa, you're head of comms for one of the world's largest digital currencies, or an asset management currency. What are you seeing, from that side of things in relation to this conversation?
So yeah, at Grayscale, we're primarily going after the investor audience, but I think for everyone, Michelle made such a good point. Like we're all in the same boat. So as strategies shift, so for example, like I think there was so much based around like, hey, I'm in town, I'm going to London, and I can meet this FT reporter in London, and really leverage kind of that scarcity element of being in a physical place and really having appreciation for meeting in person. We now see that like it's not as necessary. You don't need that component to get in front of a reporter. And there's been a exceptional willingness of reporters to connect virtually now more than ever, perhaps. From my experience, at least, there's been a handful of reporters that are willing to engage that we haven't been working with before. And I think that's a component of a couple of things. Perhaps that is, people are covering so many different things and they need to get up to speed. And also just the story's changing so quickly these days. So it's certainly changed, but it's opened up a lot of opportunities too. And that's something for people to keep in mind is now's a great time to kind of flex that creative muscle.
Okay, yeah, and I want to jump into what we're seeing, and I'll go back to you, Drea, first on this one. As a content writer, you're always trying to be in tune with the pivots and developing the strategy around pivots for companies and how they're messaging those pivots and things like that. We're seeing pivots all over the place, and I know all of us can probably talk to this, so this is probably a good one for all of us to probably dig into a little bit. What are you seeing as far as the pivots go, and how is the messaging needing to be more sensitive to what's going on right now? What counsel have you given clients? Just where have you seen, not just from a product perspective, but pivots in messaging and things like that?
Well, I just came out when I was listening to Marissa with a cheesy tagline, content is king, context is queen. You're welcome. I hope somebody laughs. So I guess
No.
Thank you. Well, I guess, so not, in terms of pivot, I think in our particular group of clients, there's been some slowdown in decision making. We haven't had a full-on pivot so much as we've had clients surfacing that suddenly want to grab a ton of market share, that have a new opportunity they haven't seen before. And then the others who are in, cloud computing, AI, blockchain, have kind of been holding steady, and maybe we're lucky in that sense. But for the ones who are looking to where to go next, I've been focusing really hard on context. So because I think thoughtful content is more important than ever, and you could cheapen your content by putting coronavirus at the end of any headline. And I want to be very careful to avoid that and always ask, why is this happening? Why now? Why this? Why now? So I've been, drilling our thought leaders to really continue to speak very precisely to their readership and to their demographic, and to some extent harness their networks more than they have before, instead of putting big picture content out there thinking, well, how can we strategically harness your existing network to get some traction? Case in point, one of our VC clients, who we usually put on pubs like Value Walk, so big picture investment type pubs, recently wrote a really deep Medium post on a blockchain graph database, and then sent it to his network and got a portfolio startup, 2 new enterprise clients, which was just like, wow, which was amazing. And he did that using a completely different tactic than before. So I'm thinking deep content, how do we talk to your network? How can we achieve your business goals in new and creative ways?
Fantastic, great advice there. I think there's, and we're definitely going to use context as queen, going forward. So I'm going to jump to Marissa. Marissa, related to the same line of thought here, and what do you do now? You know, we're in an economic recession basically, and you're on that side of things with, you know, investors basically. And what is it that they're wary of as far as investing goes, and how have you changed messaging to reflect such themes?
Well, I think what's important to take note of is like spending, investing. That's not necessarily less for everyone, but it certainly has changed. And so leaning into how it's changed and really addressing the now of the situation is really important. So, you know, from our end, we've always had certain messages around having a diversified portfolio and thinking about Bitcoin as a safe haven. And those kinds of messages have really been elevated in recent months. And I think we've been happily surprised that our conversations with investors have just really shown that people that are already investing with us, their convictions are remaining strong. And that's something that we can add on top of our messaging when we're going to other external audiences, whether it's press or prospective clients, and reinforce that, you know, it's important to have a diversified portfolio. Resilient portfolio is very important. We've all experienced the drawdowns, and the convictions that existed before still remain true. And that's been something to certainly elevate during this time. And we've seen that resonate with external audiences.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, you know, going on to Michelle for kind of a little bit of a similar conversation. As the head of comms for an investment firm, you know, Techstars 2,100 portfolio companies within it, and hundreds of geographically dispersed employees. I mean, obviously Bitcoin and everything else is global as well. Describe the importance of internal comms in that way. How are you keeping everyone informed in the strategy, and not only that, with safety and travel and everything else that's happening?
Yeah, it's definitely a big undertaking, much like everyone else probably on this panel and listening in and around the world. About mid-March, it hit us the hardest when it hit the US, but we had already been dealing with it quite heavily, particularly with Italy and a little bit in Asia, with the programs that we had, some accelerator programs in play and things like that. And so it started off a little bit manageable for us, dealing with the Italy, dealing with Lisbon, certain things like that. But when it hit the US and it hit 16 of our programs for term one, we had to really kind of very quickly reorient how we communicated internally, because we needed to make some really massive operational changes very, very fast to accommodate the circumstances and continue to support our founders and figure out how to help our MDs and founders keep going, because it was important that we not just hit the brakes and put our heads in the sand. And so the internal comms piece was really a nice forcing function for us to speak with one voice as Techstars, communicate out to all of the programs, all of the founders, all of the portfolio companies. We created a centralized resource hub, where we not only host our own content, we host any content that's helpful. We work with Cooley, we work with Silicon Valley Bank, some of our other partners for things like that. And the idea of just getting as much information out as possible. And for us, internal comms is a little bit different than your average structure, because we certainly have staff at Techstars, but our founders, our portfolio companies, our investors, the way our network operates, those in effect are also sort of a hybrid of internal and external comms. It's not exactly the same as media relations, which would be fully external. And so understanding what each of those audiences was going through, what they wanted from Techstars and needed from Techstars, and what we were capable of doing, and getting organized around that very quickly, and being just very informative, very regular communications, very clear communications. That was what we really rallied around very quickly to try to help everybody at scale.
And somebody mentioned in the chat that there was a rebranding rollout happening too. Is that the case? So maybe talk about how the heck you manage that.
When it rains, it pours, man. It rains, it pours. Yeah. So we completely rebranded Techstars. You guys may have noticed the really amazing new logo. It was complete with rebranding all of our programs, redoing a lot of our tech stack, our new website. And all of that was happening as we decided to move those 16 term one accelerator programs virtual, which required us to use a whole different technology platform than what we were already operating on. So we had a lot of sort of competing parallel interests from a tech perspective that we were really working across marketing, across product, across engineering to try to solve all at one time. And I, you know, for me, coming from the large agency world and Fortune 50, I've seen some pretty remarkable you know, quick scale up responses. And this is definitely in the top that I've seen. I was really impressed with how the organization came together. But yeah, you know, it did, unfortunately, and unfortunately, I mean, COVID in general is unfortunate on so many levels. And I don't want to say that is an understatement by any means, but it was something that we were really excited about in January and February. And you just pivot so fast, you know, as an organization, but it's not just operational, it's emotional. But we did. So kudos to everyone at my organization who was working on that, because it was definitely a large undertaking that was done very well.
And speaking of the pivot, I mean, thanks for that, Michelle. That was great insight. And speaking of the business pivot, I'm going to go to Leah on this. This is something we've experienced at Cast Influence with our startup tech clients. If you want to speak to maybe what some of our clients are offering and what the pivots were within the client and how we were able to manage that from a PR perspective. And even if they're offering discounts, freemiums, those types of things, what's helpful right now to assist in the PR effort along with those examples?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And you all of my panelists just gave me so many different things I can riff off of. But in terms of the messaging, like Drea, what you were saying, just to put it into context for anyone listening in, that it really doesn't make sense to do the same type of digital marketing or advertising or even outbound comms you were doing in December or January today. And to just give an example of that is, imagine you're a luxury brand and you're trying to sell a very expensive handbag or something like that. It's not going to resonate at all. You have to completely scrap all of that and start over again. And I think it's really the impetus for Ben and Boulder Startup Week actually asking us to do this panel is that public relations has now come back to the forefront of the strategy that really works right now, that now nobody's really responding to advertising as much. And, you know, certain tactics and platforms like SEO is very expensive to invest in as a startup. So what works? PR. And that's something that always has been a tried and true method. So I'm very proud to be in this business and to work with all these ladies, because it's a function that is never going to go away. And I think the spotlight has kind of come back on us as a team of people that are communications experts for customers, for clients, for community, but also for your internal team. So to go back to your question, Justin, about the pivot, a specific example of a client that we work with, Cheetah, in the Bay Area, they had actually come to us in the middle of the COVID crisis, really in March, starting to take hold in California, where restaurants were closing down and people were starting to get concerned about the food supply chain. And what Cheetah was prior to COVID was a restaurant wholesale delivery and supply application. You could order everything through the app as a restaurant owner and have things delivered to your door the next day. So what did they do? They didn't necessarily pivot because they already had the tech stack and the app and the supply chain and everything in place. They expanded. They actually started selling direct to consumer. And now within 4 to 8 weeks of working with them, promoting their PR story, the fact that they innovated so quickly, the fact that the founder of the company is a female, she's a woman who basically had grew up on a small farm. And so this story was very near and dear to her heart, of being able to help her community in a time of crisis. All of that is very authentic and genuine and true. We're not forcing a narrative on media. We're really just amplifying an amazing story. And I think the success that we've seen in a short amount of time with, you know, getting business coverage from Cheddar, Financial Times asked to speak with them, Wall Street Journal. We got a really wonderful story, I think, just today and built in San Francisco. KTVU did a story on them. I mean, this was a startup literally 4 months ago, no one had heard of. So I think it goes to show the strength of PR, but also being able to have a really interesting story in the time where the messaging can be customized to reporters who are looking for happy stories right now. Like, what are companies doing to help people? Another one I can give you an example of is Mural, which I think anyone on the briefing here or the call might be familiar with, but it's a digital whiteboarding tool. So they already were remote, about 100, 150 people spread across the country, but they started seeing so much incoming traffic because of people now needing to work remote. And their new user growth 15x week over week. So they're hiring like crazy. They're now managing support function. They've got community. They're expanding into education, nonprofit verticals they really, were supporting prior to COVID, but now have become essential markets that they have to service, because this is really the only way that people can stay connected. So the internal communication aspect of what we've been doing with Mural has been really, really instrumental, because keeping everyone in line, and as you're hiring new people every single day, I think they've hired 50, 60 people just in the last month or so. How do you onboard people in a remote environment? That's been an interesting case study. I could go on, but those are, I think Cheetah and Mural are really interesting examples of how you not necessarily pivot, but how do you adjust, and you do it in real time. And it's almost like trying to fix the plane while you're flying it. Like Michelle was saying earlier, there's no playbook for this. Nobody told any of us how to manage what we're managing now, but I think just from having experience and wisdom and let's try this and see what happens, we've been able to have some really wonderful success for our clients.
I think it's being really sensitive to trends too, Leah. And I think that the key takeaway out of what you just said is being authentic, and also keying on what is trending and making your company available to those trends. But do it in an absolute sincere way that your company really means it. So that's where I think we've seen the best success with that. There is a question that came in that is a common question across PR, not just related to COVID. And we could actually do a whole panel discussion on this question, because there's so many data points around it. But I want to thank you for asking the question. I just don't think we're going to be able to cover all of how you can do it today, but I do want to ask each of you how you go about doing this. Do you leverage analytics to make your PR decisions based off of data? And if so, how? And I could start with whoever wants to raise their hand. Anyway, I'm going to call on somebody. Okay, Marissa, how do you guys measure
that? So I think it's a very good question. I think there's a lot of different ways to go about measuring the impact of PR, but when you think about you leveraging data to inform your comms decisions, I think one of the best examples that comes to mind for us is, in something as simple as our social media and seeing the posts that get the most engagement. And that informs us as to what are the messages that our audience wants to hear more of, what's resonating the most, and what kinds of followers we have. So it's very clear that for us, we have like a lot more crypto enthusiasts following us on Twitter than say like financial advisors or maybe institutional investors. So we can tailor our message accordingly to that audience, and it certainly does inform. And the balance is also keeping in mind that the data doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And so you've got to be mindful of what else is going on, where your audience lives, what you're hearing anecdotally, what your experience tells you, and all of that. So very, very broad response, but I'd say it's just one of many things to.
So I actually just did a report. I'm gonna even though I'm the moderator, I'm gonna step over it a little bit here, but I just did a little bit of a report on this, and a lot of it that we do to inform decisions. We do a lot of trend analysis within our database and what's written, and then we also take what gets written about us or about our clients, and we do look at social impact. You can also look at correlation data when it comes to working with your whatever systems you might have in place. So depending on where your startup is and how big your company is, You may not have access to certain pieces of data or analytics, but where can you correlate that data? Are you seeing a spike in how many acquisitions you have over a period of time related to a series of media wins overall, readership, those types of things? There's so many ways we can slice and dice analytics. So I'm going to move on from it, but we wanted to at least address that question because I think that question is really a relevant question. And I'm happy, I think we can have almost another discussion completely around that. So if that person that asked that question, you want to connect with us, let's continue that conversation and maybe we can learn more about your specifics and maybe we can help you there. So I forgot where I left off with who, but I'm going to go to, Leah, let's just go with you again here. So PR firms, like, sometimes during turbulent times, companies cut marketing, public relation efforts. Can you talk to about why this is probably not the time for that? Are you seeing this out there? I've seen some of it. It really strikes me as odd.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because this is the first crisis pandemic I've ever experienced. Most of us, I'm sure, too, but this is not my first recession. And typically when I worked at other big agencies, that's how I know Michelle is from Edelman, from Outcast, Cooper Katz and Company in New York City. Whenever there was some kind of a contraction or, the mortgage fallout with 2008, 2009, we saw huge layoffs happening, not just because when clients were retracting budgets, that meant the PR agencies were now letting go of most of their team. If anything, I'm seeing we've been getting more business from people coming to us saying, we need crisis communication support, we need internal comms support, we need outbound comms support. Like, people just really need PR right now. So it's the first time I've seen that in my career where I'm actually getting more business and I'm busier than I ever have been. But then also I'm kind of want to address Brian's question where he was saying, can you offer a perspective here on what are maybe some strategies that smaller startups can focus on? I know we've mentioned Grayscale, you're huge, Techstars is huge, Mural, they're a startup, but they do have budget and they are scaling their Series A. What's something that maybe, a startup that's seed funded could implement right now? I would say, going back to what we talked about before with freemium offers, companies that have interesting stories to share about, I did have a 30-day free trial of my software. Now I'm extending it to 90 days, or I'm giving it away to universities and education for free. That's a PR angle that you can leverage. It's not so much about taking advantage of a crisis. It's more about how you're being responsive and sensitive to what's happening right now. The altruistic aspect of what Cheetah's doing with groceries and delivery and offering a contactless service for people that are at high risk and are scared to leave their homes and go to grocery stores. That's a really interesting story. So I think if you just step away from, I'm trying to sell my service and keep my team employed, if you really look at, well, what are we as a company doing that's relevant right now? That's an interesting story to tell reporters. Reach out to them on Twitter, reach out to them on LinkedIn. Socials, I think, is a much more effective way to get a hold of press nowadays, because with email inboxes, if you look at anyone's inbox, it's exploding. But a direct line of communication, typically from a founder of a startup, is a really effective way to get in front of someone and say, hey, we're doing this thing and we'd love to tell you about it. And I understand you're busy, but try not to be so much forcing your story, but say, I'm a resource to you, like what Michelle was saying earlier. Just be helpful.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go back to Michelle actually, because she's pretty uniquely qualified for this whole situation, and she comes from a pretty serious crisis comms background at a large agency before she got to Techstars. And I think this will be, because we're kind of running out of time here, I want to make sure we address this question. And what are your top recommendations for brands right now who may be experiencing layoffs or brand pivots?
Top recommendations. Pivots right now, a lot of pivots are happening, and they're fantastic stories, as Leah has touched on. It's gotten noisy for reporters, so it's kind of in this traditional catch-22 of it's a great story, but why is it different than the 10 other pivots I heard about today? So it makes it really challenging to follow a media environment that moves this fast-paced. In terms of crisis communications around pivots and layoffs, you have to tread really, really carefully. You've got to be transparent. If you don't know the answer, you need to say you don't know the answer. Putting your head in the sand isn't going to help. It's actually going to put you in the negative. Brushing things off and not answering may seem like a really nice deferent strategy right now, but it's not going to engender trust, and it's not going to engender a lot of attention when you're ready to communicate. So the more you think about, no matter how painful it is right now, what do I want 3 or 4 steps down the road from different people, the more you can think about what the best way to say something that is not good news. And I think one of the things that's happening is everyone's going through this. The more empathetic you can be in your messaging, the more you can, this is getting a little outside of PR, but PR and operations obviously go hand in hand. And with startups, a founder is wearing all the hats. So there often isn't a whole lot of separation. If you think about the operational decisions you make, how can they help your PR engagement better? And be as positive as possible. For example, with layoffs, are you connecting employees with other companies that are hiring? I've seen a lot of different kind of platforms set up to connect who's laying off and who's hiring. And, can you talk about the ways in which you're trying to soften the blow? Can you make those decisions operationally and roll them out internally and externally, so that don't just think about the decision you have to make, no matter how difficult it is as the founder. Try to think operationally, how can you help the people that are affected by this? And then how do you communicate in a way that is informative, is clear, is transparent, and, is empathetic as you can be in the situation?
Yeah, I want to actually ask you another question while I still have you, Michelle. You've had to actually do your own pivots within Techstars, and related to that, there's been the demo days going fully remote and those types of things. So what are the impacts on that? Because I know a lot of companies are moving to that direction, doing virtual stuff like we are right now. What are we seeing as far as the impacts of that?
So really good, positive things that we're seeing. When you have to make pivots at that scale that impact so many people at one time, you really, our biggest thing was, how do we ensure the integrity of the program? How do we ensure the integrity of the experience? And how do we do this in a way that provides value to everyone who will either attend or is pitching? And particularly in that case, that founder-investor relationship. You lose a lot of things when you're not in person. We all know the interpersonal value, but we've seen a lot of great things come out of being virtual because of the accessibility. An example is one of the first demo days we had this term was our Hub 71 accelerator out in Abu Dhabi. We had 3x engagement coming out of that, because suddenly Silicon Valley had direct line access to Abu Dhabi, and they had it at their fingertips at their time based on when they wanted to go watch the videos and pitches. And across the board with I believe at this point we've executed 12, I could be wrong, I think 12 of our term 1 demo days. We're seeing a consistent 2x and 3x engagement and registration because of the accessibility. So it's trade-offs, right? And we're starting to look at that as an organization, both for the future in a COVID reality, but also very long-term. What did we learn from this? What do we want to keep no matter what the circumstances are? And so looking at the balance of accessibility and interpersonal, like direct in connection, has been a real interesting learning for us. And there've been a lot of really great positives for everyone that have come out of it. We've gotten great founder feedback, great investor feedback, and we've gotten a lot of really cool coverage from reporters. Reporters like the accessibility as well. And it's given them time to dive deeper because they have the time to do it at their leisure. So we've seen some really great stuff.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that goes into overall content strategies a little bit more too, and the actual mechanisms you're using for your content strategy. And so I know Grayscale is probably doing more virtual stuff as well. So how are you at Grayscale, Marissa, using virtual to stay connected?
Sure. I mean, like virtually as a team, we're leveraging all sorts of technology to make sure we're staying connected. When it comes to staying connected with external audiences, something that we recently experimented with was, and this is just kind of in light of so much webinar fatigue, as I say that as we're literally participating in a webinar. But you know, within 2 weeks, it was just like invitation, invitation, invitation of, you know, this brand can help you right now. And we decided to bring on an economist that we're friendly with and just talk about what's happening right now in markets. And it wasn't a sell for our product. It was just let's kind of unpack what's happening with a subject matter expert in that. For those that attended, found it to be very valuable, very like a time well spent. And it kind of goes back to the strategy that we've all mentioned throughout this conversation, which is how can you be a resource right now? As it's not, we have to be sensitive to the uncertainties in the situation that everyone is respectively in. And it's not necessarily about the hard sell, but being a resource, and people are going to remember that, and that's going to stick with them.
Yeah, thanks. And I think I'm going to go to Drea here. There's a question that came through, and it has to do with social media. So I'm going to pull that into content strategy a little bit and I'm going to do the best I can to combine this question. The question itself was, what are the quick and effective ways small businesses can make impact after recently making a pivot using social media? And a question that I was actually going to tee up for you was, you know, what other content strategies can you suggest to keep companies or clients relevant? And I think those go hand in hand. So I think there's the content strategy and the social media strategy, as well as the PR strategy, are all working together in the marketing strategy and everything, right? So how are your clients, or are you working, or what are you suggesting to your clients as far as their content strategies go, and in relation to social media too?
Well, as a rule of thumb, we try to match the content strategies to the business strategies. So to me, what the business is doing to stay competitive and relevant in its marketplace will then naturally radiate out to what we do with content. So, you know, for example, actually Leah and Marissa had already mentioned two things. Leah, you mentioned giving things away to universities and NGOs for free as one strategy, and Marissa, you mentioned, you know, bringing in an economist. To give you all an example, so what I do with clients is talk to the founders and say, well, how are you guys building, you know, your moat? What are you doing besides being an awesome product? Are you gathering and selling proprietary data? You know, do you have adjacent swim lanes? You know, for example, we have a telehealth platform for veterinarians, and one thing that we've done there is brought in a lot of DVMs as sort of author evangelists, because they can talk best to what's going on for, you know, their own people, and their expert resources for the media. And then another place we've found opportunities, because that telehealth is obviously getting really crowded, favorite place to pivot right now for a lot of people. So we found opportunities in them partnering with scientific organizations for research, providing data clearinghouse for animal nonprofits, creating new kinds of triage services with other providers. So everything that you're doing as a startup to sort of expand your range and your partnerships, you know, we also want to create content around that, create new avenues into the media through that.
Thank you. I think that's actually a really good way to probably wrap up this conversation. We only have a couple minutes left. I do want to say thank you to everybody that's on here. I know Ben's probably going to say that too here in a second, but thank you to everybody that came today. Thank you for our panelists. I think it's really important that we continue this conversation, because this is a moving target, daily, hourly. I know I could speak for Leah a little bit. I know we're giving a lot of consultation when it comes, almost like we're, you know, almost like we're psychiatrists in some instances, because we're really having to dig into the messaging and how, we can help companies make it through this. And that's really our sole purpose. And I think that's everybody in this panel's sole purpose, is making sure that whoever we are working with has the most effective plan and strategy with their communications going forward. And Ben, I'll leave it to you.
Sounds good. Yeah, this was great. I hope everyone on the call realizes just like the caliber of folks on the panel here. So really appreciate you all taking the time to volunteer during Boulder Startup Week and share some of these insights and some of these experiences. I know for me, I had a few points that I thought were really helpful. We're focusing on the creativity and innovation of this time, being sincere, being transparent, leveraging technology and supporting others. And I also want to make sure that as we think about continuing these conversations, for everyone on the panel, what would be the best way to follow up in terms of sort of contact information? Maybe Justin, if you want to start with Cast Influence.
Yeah, I mean, you can obviously direct message us through our contact forms on our website, castinfluence.com, or you can reach out to us on LinkedIn. Lee and I are really responsive on LinkedIn or Twitter. And you just have to look us up by name. You should be able to find us.
Great. How about you, Drea?
LinkedIn is the best one for me.
Awesome. Michelle?
LinkedIn. It's going to be the easiest, most direct.
Perfect. And Marissa?
There's a consensus. LinkedIn.
LinkedIn it is. All right. Well, thank you again so much. I really appreciate you all taking the time for all the attendees. Thank you for joining us and taking time this afternoon. Also, just a quick reminder, we do have a session right after this. So we have pretty packed marketing track of Boulder Startup Week. So I hope to see you in some of the future sessions. So thank you again and hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.